So in the last kind of short session, we're moving through a number of short sessions this afternoon as we begin. In the last session, we kind of talked a little bit about what disciple-making movement looks like, and you got one glimpse into what that looks like globally. And there were a few times where we kind of alluded to whether or not anything like that is happening here, right? It just so happens that Todd was part of a group, connected to a group, it's actually discipleship.org, did a study several years back. It's a pretty new, pretty fresh still, that kind of tried to understand the landscape of the North American church. And so if you're not familiar with this, he's going to get to share this with you in just a second. In fact, if you'll put up that first slide, there it is. So you'll see it's called the National Study on Disciple Making in USA Churches. You'll see sponsored by discipleship.org, conducted by Gray Matter Research. If you find this interesting, and I think you probably will, you can actually find this in more depth on the discipleship.org website. So, Todd, you learned a lot in that, I think, and some of that you could probably share with us at a high level that we would find helpful as well to understand what things look like here stateside.
That'd be great. It's great to be here with you guys. Let me just qualify. I'm going to talk pretty fast so we can get you back to table things. And Josh did some inspiration for you. I'm the bridge of the reality of where we are on things in the U.S. So
you felt good.
I don't want you to be depressed out of this section, but we are going to talk about the reality of where things are. And we're going to try to be as quantifiable on it as we can. And I'm going to try to just give you a little bit of a framework that you can weigh where we're at through that lens. And I promise you we're going to end this session today on the positive note of what are we going to do about this. And we're going to get into some talking about how do we take the negatives of this and be positive. So this study that we did with discipleship.org, the subtitle that ended up getting put on it was this: high aspirations amidst disappointing results. I don't know that you're going to be surprised by the results, but I want to tie it together for you. Finding number one in this report was that less than 5% of U.S. churches have a disciple-making culture in place. If you want to be a pessimist, 95% or more of churches, and what should the core mission of the church be? Don't have a disciple-making culture. So if we start there, the second major finding, relational disciple-making is generally, not 100%, but generally not the functional mission of the U.S. church. So now here's right away, most pastors, if just asked, what's your mission? In some form or fashion, are going to use the word discipleship or disciple-making in their mission. This study found that functionally, not aspirationally, but functionally, disciple-making is not the core mission of the U.S. church. It begs the question, what is the core mission? But we'll get to that later on. The third major finding is that programmatic strategies generally don't produce disciple-making cultures. And again, we're on the negative side here. We're 35 years into what I coined the consumer-driven operating system of the church. The consumer-driven operating system is a programmatic addition, not a disciple-making addition. We have all either started or inherited operating systems that are programmatic operating systems. That is why less than 5% of U.S. churches have a disciple-making culture, because we start or inherit operating systems that add by programs, and programs don't create disciple-making cultures. The fourth major finding, this may seem like a small deal. It's actually a bigger deal than you think. There's a lack of commonly understood and clear disciple-making vocabulary. That is both within individual churches, between churches, within networks. What one church calls a disciple, another doesn't. What somebody calls discipleship in one place is not what it is somewhere else. A convert versus a disciple. Just the language is confusing. And we'll see in a couple of minutes that infiltrates and affects the idea of culture, the definition of culture. When you don't have clear language, you're not going to have clear culture. And so it's bigger than it might seem. And here's the kicker, the fifth finding. This is not mine, this is a national study, okay? Although I agree with this one. Pastors are overly optimistic and overestimate their disciple-making impact. Now, part of let me give you an example, and it goes back to the definitions. So the amount of time that you as a pastor next week on the calendar spend in a meeting about an outreach event that's going to happen, is that disciple-making time, not disciple-making time? 20 hours of sermon prep, is it disciple-making time, not disciple-making time? And this is where the devil's in the details on definitions. If we talk about Jesus-style relational disciple-making versus programmatic disciple-making, that's where the devil gets in the details. And pastors have a programmatic mindset. And so their understanding of what time they're spending on disciple-making is through the lens of programmatic disciple-making, not through the lens of relational Jesus-style disciple-making. And that's where part of that gap comes in.
Yeah, I just want to say, I was actually one of the ones that participated in this study. It was very interesting as you're going through and you're answering some of the questions. One of the early questions is kind of, how do you think you're doing? And then you go through and you answer all the questions and you find out how you're really doing. And I was one of those ones who was much more optimistic, and it was a reality call for me, kind of a wake-up call to see that what I thought we were doing as it related to disciple making is not actually what we were doing. We had aspirations. We thought we were doing something that was leading to disciples making disciples, maybe who would make disciples, but it wasn't. And so what really is at the heart of this, going back to that first point and what the distinction there is the idea of culture. Why is culture so important? Maybe even help us understand what's at the heart of culture.
Right. Yeah, let's press into a definition of culture. We all probably have different ones. In the context that I've personally used at Exponential for 18 years and what we did in this discipleship study, just imagine concentric circles. You should see them on the board right now. Start in the center with mission. There's a mission for your organization. Outside of that, and a mission is what we do. Then there's values, and I'm going to use the definition of a value. A value is not what we do. A value shapes how we do everything we do. So you've got what you do, then you've got a shaping factor of how you do what you do. Language then becomes the stories we tell, the celebrations we give, the language that we're inspiring people to, how we bring the language to bear within that. And finally, where the rubber meets the road is then the behaviors that get put in place. The red arrow that goes through this represents the ripple effect that the impact we have to the communities around us with gospel saturation, reducing lostness, is going to come through the behaviors. Now, the challenge is the nature of the behavior we call people to as the outcome of this is driven by not the aspirational mission, not the aspirational values, not the aspirational language, but by the functional mission, the functional values, and the functional language that we put in place. Does that make sense? But it's the alignment of all those things. And here's the second point. It's always present. And you've got to make the distinction between aspirational and reality. Right now in your church, there is a culture. You can map the real functional mission to the functional values, to the language you use, and that all drives the behaviors you're getting inside your church. And there's an alignment to it all. I've already made the point, the third point, that really culture measures reality, not the aspirations or what we're hoping with good intentions.
Yeah, and so as you put this study together, you talked about this kind of within the framework of 5 levels, okay? And it'd be good, I think, for you to unpack that for us, because I think that will help us maybe begin to understand what the cultures at these 5 different levels actually do look like.
That's great. It wasn't in the original 5, but the 5 levels, I'm going to walk us through unpacking it. I want to go ahead and mention before I do really quickly, if you go back to the 5 findings of the study, okay, and you line it up with the culture piece for a second, one of those 5 findings was that disciple making is not functionally the mission of the church. Look at the core thing in culture. It starts with mission. If it's not functionally our core mission, we're not going to get a culture of disciple making. Look at another one of the findings. There's not a commonly understood or easily embraced language. So if we've got a very loose language that's not pulling people into what we're doing, that's the third element of the culture piece there. So the study sort of can unpack for us and highlight where the elements of culture are. They're not fitting together. What Paul's asking is, when we did the study, we used what we call a level 5 framework. I just want to quickly walk you through the level 5 framework. If you do go look at the details of the study, this will come to life for you a little bit more, but I want to give you a tangible handle to pull on. I want to start it this way with the levels. Seasons of life. Make it personal for a second. Everything has a season, Ecclesiastes tells us. And as an engineer, I'm going to link it to math. Just think about a bell curve. There's plus or addition, there's plateau, and there's subtraction. As much as we don't like to think about it, all of our churches will one day not exist because there's a bell curve. Sometimes we get a breakout to another one and another one, but eventually there's a plateau that will put us under, that's going to come down. So everything has a season. A few years ago at Exponential, we wanted to measure what the percentage of churches were that were either in the subtracting mode, the adding mode, or now let me bring in multiplication. So we did a study, a national, full-fledged national study, to try to find out how many churches were in each of those categories: subtracting, adding, multiplying. When we pulled it together, though, we found a little bit of confusion that between subtracting and adding, you had plateauing. So you couldn't put every church into subtraction or addition. Some were plateauing. And likewise, between adding and multiplying is reproducing. And it's a really important point, the reproducing. When Josh talks about 4 generations broadly, let me suggest this to you mathematically. There's nothing you can do right now, and this is positive too, but let me do the negative. There's nothing you can do right now to decide to multiply and guarantee you will multiply. Multiplication is an outcome, not something you do. It's an outcome of 4 generations of reproduction happening broadly in 4 generations into the future. Think about 4 generations now on your family line. Your great, 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 great grandkids will not know your name. If you think you can control anything about your great, great, great grandchildren, then I want to invest in some stock of something you're doing. They're not even going to know your name. All you can do is the first generation of reproduction of what you're doing with your kids. And the only question is, what are they going to do about beyond them? And that's where culture fits in. How do we embed the culture so that when we reproduce, it can reproduce multiple generations in a way that we still have an impact, we just don't control it. So this idea of reproduction was a big aha for us that fits between addition and multiplication. God shows us the normative thing is addition, but through addition we get reproduction and multiplication. Does that make sense? So we did this study, and here's what
Let me interject real quick with something too, and I think, Todd, you were the one who shared this with me, that it's 75% of U.S. churches that are planted will never plant another church, therefore short-circuiting the chance to multiply, right? So 75% of planted churches will never plant another church.
Play off of Josh's thing again. That's a national study, a full-blown national study. 75% of churches planted don't turn around and get involved in planting. Right there, mathematically, guarantees we can't get multiplication in the U.S. You've got to go 4 generations into the future broadly. And if 3 out of 4 don't reproduce, you can't get multiplication. That's why making a distinction between reproduction and multiplication is really important. We can't control the multiplication. All we can do is control the reproduction. And if 3 out of 4 don't reproduce, we don't sustain and get to multiplication. I'm just doing mathematics. That's not making anything up there. So we basically took the idea mathematically of subtracting, plateauing, adding, reproducing, and multiplying, the 5 basic elements of math, and labeled them level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here's what we did in the national study. 100% of U.S. churches you can put into subtracting, plateauing, or adding. They're in one of those 3 categories. We found that 35% are subtracting, 35% are plateauing, 30% are adding, if you just start with those. Let's just put the thumb in the air and say that's about a third are subtracting, about a third are plateauing, and about a third are adding. So 2/3 are subtracting or plateauing, and then 7% reproducing come out of the 100%. Just like with the human body, the human is somewhere in the phase of adding, plateauing, or subtracting. Not all humans reproduce. And so what we did was we measured out of the 100% that were somewhere between subtracting, plateauing, and adding, what percent were also reproducing. And in the church planting side, that number came out to 7%. In the study we did on disciple making using the same framework but applied to disciple making, it was 4%. So somewhere in that 4 to 7% that are reproducing, and then ultimately 0% on the multiplication part, because again, mathematically, you can't get there. If you've only got 4 or 7 reproducing, you're not going to get to the multiplication part of it. So here's where I want to make it personal for all of you. These are just the numbers. Take it about 2/3 subtracting or plateauing. In the scorecard of the U.S. church now, most of us would like to be on the fastest growing, largest, most innovative list that Outreach Magazine puts out. What that represents for a minute, I want you to think of it as a magnet that we're going to put in the middle of these 5 levels. So the red thing you should be seeing on the screen, just pretend we put a magnet right in the middle of the level 3 piece. The operating system, this programmatic operating system that we're talking about in the U.S. church, it's like a magnet at level 3. You don't want to be at level 1 if you can be at level 3. You don't want to be at level 2 if you can be at level 3. We want to get to level 3, and it's like a magnet pulling us there. So here's the story I want to share, and I want you to just think about it through your church. About 12 years ago, we got a group of 12 megachurch pastors together in a room for a retreat. There wasn't really an agenda. We just wanted to talk about, they were all involved in church planting, and they would have all been somewhere between level 3 and 4 on this framework. We went around the room one by one to 12 megachurch pastors, and the question was very simple. In all of your life, personal life, family life, work, everywhere, what is the single biggest tension that you have? And the first person answered, oh, that's easy. I launched my church, grew it to a mega status. We did multi-site. We did externally focused. We've done all the things. And he said, there's not enough years left in my life to just keep growing this thing bigger. I'm interested in changing the conversation from where's the next one to how do we release 450 of our people to take our city. And I get goosebumps telling the story right now because immediately the second person said, oh, that's mine. The third person said, that's mine. 12 out of 12 leaders in the room from all over the country, level 3 and 4, all had the same thing across their entire, 12 out of 12, that were, I just don't want to keep growing this thing bigger. Well, what had gotten them to where they were was this magnet. They're in that operating system programmatically to get them there. So here's what the second question was. We went around the room and said, well, what's your biggest barrier? Why are you not moving from 4 to 5 or moving more in that direction? And I'm going to give you as close to verbatim as I can. The first leader said, oh, it's easy. We have an $11.2 million building debt. If we do more active church planting, we're going to lose the ability to pay the debt. And so there's this tension on our building debt. We got to megachurch leader number 2, and I'm not making up these numbers. He said, oh, it takes 920 children's workers to run our children's ministry every week. How in the world can I get our children's staff to talk about releasing people to be missionaries out taking the city when I can't fill the 920 spots every day? We went to the third megachurch pastor and he said, oh, we're doing the multi-site thing, we're killing it, we're growing it, but every time we release one of these campus pastors to go plant a church, we lose momentum and we lose numbers and it's like sideways energy. All 12 answers were like what I'm giving you right now of all these things. Now here's what I don't want you to miss. Every magnet pulls from both directions. So you should see the magnet now having arrows pulling from both directions. Don't miss this. The operating system that's programmatically driven in what we're living in, pulls us to level 3. And there's a formula that gets you there in the form of buildings and building debt, great killer children's ministry, great programs, world-class leaders. Think about it. Every single thing that got those 12 megachurch pastors to where they are the very things holding them back from getting to where God wants them to be. The magnet is an ornery thing. And it's because it's rooted in, I'm going to end it with this, how you add makes all the difference. If you add programmatically, there's an ornery magnet that's always going to hold you back from where you want to be. To overcome it, it's a relational, disciple-making, programmatic engine for adding. That's the only way we're going to get where we need to be. And so if you're here for the next session, we're going to unpack a little bit more of the operating system part of this. What is it about the operating system? But it's the magnet that we've got to figure out how to overcome.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Todd. I hope that was, revelatory for you. I know it has been revelatory for me as well, as Todd has unpacked that in previous conversations that we had the chance to kind of work through this. And so really, if you could go ahead and put the question on the screen, it's really more of a prompt. We want you to actually think about how the magnet is affecting you. And you may be in a different place. You may, as you're looking through these 5 levels, you may say, we're a level 2 church and we've really been trying to get to level 3. That's what we're looking to do. So the magnet is pulling us this way. Or you may be at that place where you're saying, we've been trying to break free of that level 3 for a while now, move to level 4, level 5. You'll have different experiences, but we'd like for you to discuss and share that.
Yeah. And let me clarify, it isn't linear. You don't have to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. You can be at level 1 and have level 4 behavior. So in that 7% that we're reproducing at level 4, that 7% is made up of some churches at level 1, some at level 2, some at level 3. The issue is, as you're reproducing, if you do, you've still got an operating system, and the key is the operating system desperately, in an ornery way, wants to pull you to that level 3 thing programmatically. It's programmatic addition to get you there. Go back to the national study, finding number 3 in the national study. Programmatic strategies don't generally create disciple-making culture. That was a finding in the national study, that programmatic strategies don't generate disciple-making culture.
Phenomenal stuff from Todd Wilson. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Now stay tuned next week as we talk about some practical next steps to shift culture and launch new churches. Once again, thank you for listening to the Real Life Theology Podcast, where we renew the teachings of Jesus to fuel disciple making. The Real Life Theology Podcast champions all biblical truth, including hard topics, by sharing discussions, webinars, public presentations, and similar resources to fuel disciple making among all nations and ethnic groups. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you next week.